Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Disafemi History Podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In today's episode, featuring Dr. Justine K. Collins, who is a legal historian specializing in the intersection of law and society, particularly within colonial slavery laws of the Atlantic world. With your host, Wendy Aris, and in the discussion, we'll be diving into the topic of private acts in Jamaica.
Thank you so much, Justine, for coming on to the podcast, Disafemi History, and to speak again about this time about private acts. I know that you've been on the podcast a number of times, and before we start, I'll have you just do a brief introduction.
Sure. Hi, Wendy. Thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure as usual. So, my name is Justine Collins. I'm a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at SOAS, University of London, and I predominantly research colonial slavery. Currently, I'm working on a project on the indigenous slavery and the law in the Caribbean region and the wide Atlantic.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I know, as I said, we're talking about the intricacies of rights with private bill creation by the Jamaican plantocracy. So again, can you just provide us, I guess, a brief overview of your findings for this particular act that you were looking at?
Sure. So, our main argument is to show how profoundly racialized Jamaican colonial society was during slavery. So much so that the actions of the plantocracy were predominantly motivated by race relations and racist ideologies, which is opposed to like simple explanations or justifications of capitalism and world generation for colonial slavery. And I found that this obsession with race and power had the plantocracy constantly shifting their views on mixed race and Black people within the colonial society. So this research looks particularly at the legal mechanisms they employed to control social mobility, class mobility by focusing on race.
Yep. Thank you so much for that. And now I'm going to ask, I usually ask everybody, what is their why? So what prompted your interest to explore this topic of mixed race within the Jamaican colonial context?
Yeah, so I'll be very frank here. A conversation you and I had
Yes.
prompted this. We had a discussion, I believe, after one of our sessions on lesser known research, and you told me about coming across one of these bills, these private bills, and you sent me the reference. And from then, it just opened up a whole different world to me about, this phenomenon of racial passing that I was unaware of before. And it's led to this my side project, I call it, because it's a little, deviation from what I usually study, but it's been very interesting. So thank you for that.
No problem. No, definitely these private acts, when I did come across it in my research for my family history, it just, I was just basically confused by it because I just couldn't believe of the extent to which, people would, in terms of having their children, not only just free, but then to have them deemed as being legally white. I mean,
Yes.
I didn't even think that that was a thing.
Yes.
So it was very shocking to kind of
Yes.
see that and to know that these were laws passed, and it wasn't just once or twice. This was quite significant going on,
Yes.
during
Yes.
that time. So I know you mentioned a bit. So how did this, with the Jamaican plantocracy, navigate the issue of race and identity, particularly in the relation to individuals where they were of both race groups?
Yes. So generally, Black or mixed race persons, um, even where free or manumitted, were still shut out of social, political, and legal life. So materially, their lives, by law, did not differ much from the enslaved when it came to these things. For instance, they still use the slave courts.
Yeah.
and their testimonies held no more weight than an enslaved person. Um, for instance, the Jamaican slave code provided that neither free, mixed race persons or blacks or even the enslaved could give testimony in trials against white persons. So even if you're free,
Yeah.
you still had the same law as enslaved people. And the free people of colors, they were called, could not hold political positions either by election or appointments and were outrightly excluded from political life. Also, the Jamaican legislature ensured that this was affirmed by passing laws which prohibited mixed persons from holding public office or sitting in the assembly. And even where mixed persons could acquire and own land, the amount was limited. The colonial Caribbean was a place that the English sense of property and sanctity related to property was transferred. Therefore, property ownership translated to status. So the more property one had, the more that they were socially elevated. And it is for this reason and in this space that a sect of the affluent, propertied, mixed race persons sought to attain rights and privileges entitled to naturally born English persons. And so this is how that was navigated to begin with.
Yeah, so it's just
Yeah,
basically, again, it's just using the law to be able to control and to provide power to who they wanted to provide power
exactly.
to. So
Exactly.
it just, I know that we spoke about this before. It's just basically weaponizing,
It's
um,
weaponizing. Hmm.
weaponizing the law to avail a few individuals, and if they had
Exactly.
enough money, which equaled power, they were
Yes.
able to then navigate and dictate how their future generations were going to proceed.
Yes, of
Now,
course.
I know this leads again about, can you just elaborate a little bit more on the legal and social implications for individuals who are mixed race in Jamaican colonial society?
Sure. So, with the rise in plantation slavery, the enslaved Africans and blacks eventually outnumbered the white population by the early 18th century, which led, of course, to the rise in miscegenation,
Mm-hmm.
leading to a significant increase in mixed race persons. So, this rise in mixed race persons catalyzed what I call the stratification of Jamaican colonial society, and therein emerged a social rank of status and order based on skin color and family connections from birth. So the ranking ranged from the lowest strata to the upper, and these were, and I'll start with the lower. At the lowest, or rather at the bottom, was the Negro,
Yeah.
and this was a person born of two black parents. And then there was the Sambo or Zambo, and that would be a person born of a mulatto parent and a black parent. And then there'll be a mulatto, a person born of one white parent and one black parent. There was the quadroon, a
Mm-hmm.
person born of one white parent and one mulatto parent. There was the musty, a person born of one white parent and one quadroon parent. The
Mm-hmm.
mustafino, a person born of one white parent and one musty parent. The quintoon, a person born of one white parent and one mustafino parent. The octoroon, a person born of one white parent and one quintoon parent. And even within these, there were further gradations. So, for example, there was the mestizo, which would
Mm-hmm.
be a person born of a black parent and a native parent.
Yeah.
So they weren't necessarily included on this social strata, but you would see them pop up from time to time in archives and documents and in correspondences and so forth. So this showed the obsession with skin color and racial origins created this system of racial blurring and confusion over racial lines, dependent on one's degree of whiteness or blackness. And from the year of 1773, they initiated a system of what I call racial passing in Jamaica. So persons who were lighter in color than a mustee were legally defined as white and received full rights, privileges, and immunities attached to that. So just as if you were a natural born English person. And those who were darker in complexion than a mustafino were classed as mulatto. This legally classified group was twice divided into free browns. So this would be musties, quadroons, and mulattoes. And then there were free blacks, which would be zambo, sambos, and negroes. And This systemized racialization that began in 1733 was due to the passing of an act which stipulated that anyone who is not above 3 degrees removed in lineal descent from their black ancestor will not be allowed to vote in polls or in elections, and that no one will be classed as mulatto after 3 generations and then shall be defined as white, and then having all these privileges, immunities, and benefits as a natural born Christian Englishman. Yeah,
Yeah, it just meant
yeah.
they didn't have any value until
Exactly. Until you were
they were certain
three
colors.
three generations
Yes.
removed from black, then you would be classified as white. But until then, yeah, yeah.
No, no, because I mean, even in my family history research, I mean, to find my African ancestor and then to know that their grandchildren were then deemed, quote unquote, legally white through this private act.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yes,
that is just mind-boggling to know
yes,
that that actually happened. I mean, you would think that that would be in a story tale to be told as opposed to what actually happened during that time. And
yes,
even these names that I'm sorry, these racial identifications, these were things that I mean, I've heard of some of those names, but when you see them on documents where they define people and they put their color designation because they have a column for it,
yes.
it
Hmm.
is just unreal. And you're like, well, what does that mean? And then to go digging deep to find those definitions is just like, this is unreal. It's like a complicated math equation type of thing. But it was something that happened during that time. But and kind of, I guess, to this day in terms of, I guess, with shadism
Yes, yes,
now in the Caribbean.
yeah.
So it I guess this is where it's basically coming from. But no, thank you, because it just one of these things that are just highly impactful. And so, with the creation of these private bills by the Jamaican plantocracy, did it intersect with the phenomenon of racial passing since they were now legally white?
Yeah, so the way private bills work is that they were requested by the very rich
Yes.
to attain certain rights and privileges, and they would send these requests to the local House of Assembly to have the request passed in law to get the desired benefits. Therefore, these bills were used by the very wealthy to give property and other rights to their mixed race children, who would then, by the passage of these bills, be deemed white.
Mm.
Their offspring will be deemed white because they would have to be from a union with another white person. And the bill made it clear that its purpose was meant to ultimately elevate their status of those mixed race persons to that of a naturally born Englishman. So, affluent fathers would use this as a means to not only just pass their property, but to ensure that the property stayed in white hands, or at least what was legally classified as white hands. Yeah.
No, definitely. And because I definitely saw that with one of my ancestors where they were from Ireland and had, it goes into they had massive influence to even have this private act
Yes.
placed through in
Yes.
order to ensure that when they passed on, that his children inherited what he amassed during his
Yes.
time in Jamaica, which was significant. So going on that theme, how were
Mhm.
these influential fathers impacting the change for the future of their children, especially in terms of inheritance?
Yes, so it was one of the most visible things was the fact that it was only the very wealthy that had this privilege to even have access to getting these rights passed.
Mm-hmm.
And so they used them to ensure that, property remained within their family, because
Yes.
most of these men had were men that had very high profile visibility, whether they were merchants or
Mm-hmm.
lawyers or whatever, but they were very propertied, but they had relationships with mixed race women.
That's right.
And so they ensured through these bills that property was passed to these women and also to their children. But within, that bill itself was so much focus on race, they had to remind them that, though you do have the taint of the black blood, this is a means of elevating you, because they mentioned that they were educated just as an English person, you know, they had the same liberties and freedoms of being baptized and
Yes.
part of the Christian church. And so all of this was to show their affinity to the white race, the nonce, the black race, and to be elevated amongst um their former class. So now they're ascending to whiteness, and so this bill um ensured that this was possible and stayed that way. Yeah.
Yes. It,
Yeah.
it definitely did. And I know that what I saw in terms of my research is, I mean, that was significant amounts in terms of what was then passed on. And then, of
Yes.
course, that they ended up owning, if their father had enslaved um,
Persons. Yeah.
individuals
Hmm.
as part of their, um,
The
I hate to
assets.
say it,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
they were inherited, and especially for their female their daughters, it made
Yes.
a massive difference as to how their lives were
Yes.
after that.
Yes.
After
Yes.
that,
Yes.
it
Yes.
it elevated them even more so,
Yes. Yeah.
because you can see it. Like, you had to go into, baptism records where it indicated for white individuals at that point, because they were no, as you said, they were no longer tainted by the drop of, having black blood in
Black
them.
blood. Yeah.
They were now considered to be fully white people.
Exactly. And I, as you mentioned, women, once they were elevated to that status, once they had property in lands, in enslaved people, they can then marry a very affluent white man. And yeah, and then continue that line, because one of the provisions within those bills were that the spew, meaning their children, had to be of a union with a white person, whether the beneficiary was a son or a daughter. You had, yeah, the line had to be continued by marrying and having children with a white person.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, definitely. And I
yeah.
definitely see that, especially for the females that did inherit, their lives were completely different. They had another
Yes,
level of autonomy and power
yes, yes.
that was not afforded to a lot of the other. And it just, as I said, when you come across these records, to see that in black and white, and how would I say, they were very affluent to be able to trade, to be able to sell their property, to
Mm-hmm,
for them to negotiate everything.
mm-hmm.
They didn't feel the need to marry some of them, and I'm just like, wow.
Yes,
When you see that, because
yes.
of what had happened, what their father did for them with these
Mm-hmm.
private acts. So, what has been, I guess, the kind of the some of the archival sources or historical evidence that you drew upon to investigate the anomaly or of racial passing in Jamaican colonial slavery?
Yes, so I looked at these bills at the National Archives in Kew, London. There was quite a collection of them there. And so I just went through them from uh, early 1700s throughout, because that's when they were most prominent, to the early 1800s. And I was just able to collect all of them, take notes. They were all very similar,
Yeah.
except for somewhere which pertain to manumission. A few were manumitting the formerly enslaved because of the role they played in quashing or prohibiting a riot or absconding. It was a reward of their freedom and some money as well. But I also noticed that within those, I call it the miscellaneous bills, because there weren't that many in comparison to passing off property. But within those miscellaneous bills, they also mentioned that the Treasury had to compensate their enslavers
Yeah.
because they were losing their property, which I found really I mean I know that this happened, but I found it really interesting that though they were rewarding them from saving them from losing hundreds if not
Yeah.
thousands of of enslaved persons and also losing their lives.
Yes.
They still had to be compensated for losing these one or two formerly enslaved persons
No,
because they
definitely.
were loyal to them. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. No.
yeah, yeah. So I did that, and I also looked at some secondary sources which covered a similar
Mm-hmm.
things. There's Horwitz and Horwitz. They initially wrote on this, but since 1960s, 1967, I
Wow.
believe, and then there's researcher Arnold Seo who touched on this race, color, miscegenation, where he discussed free people of color and he compared Jamaica and Barbados, like showing how different they were.
Yeah.
And there's Krista Petley, who wrote on free people of color and social order in Jamaica. He focused on mostly passing of property in wills. And most recently, there's Brooke Newman in her book Dark Inheritance. And she took a deep dive into Black blood, race, and sex in colonial Jamaica. And my aim was to add to the scholarship by focusing on these laws and the legitimization of racial passing.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that was that's my contribution to this form of research. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, thank you for that because it's definitely going down into these documents and knowing that because these laws that were created, this is where you'll find people. Like when you're
Yes.
investigating and researching your family history,
Yeah.
it's not only just birth, death, and marriage records.
Yes.
It is looking at the law because I can only say that it was weaponized to use to control, to determine
Yes.
what people could be able to inherit, where they could
Yes.
live, how what they did inherit influenced the direction of
Mm.
their lives because these were extremely impactful. And of course, it's not only taming the enslaved, but now this new population of these mixed race individuals that
Yes.
are free most times or that are free to now contain them, so to speak,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Very
And I
true.
know that we talked about a couple of where we made a little mention to some of these cases because I know the article that you wrote, it had both my maternal and paternal side of the
Yes.
family on here.
Okay.
So would you be able to talk to any of the, I guess, the notable examples in the cases that you had engaged for this racial passing in your article?
Sure. So one of the first one is George O'Mealy, Esquire, and he was a very affluent planter from the parish of St. John in Jamaica, and he had three children with a mixed mulatto woman named Ann Davis. And his children were granted the rights and privileges of white English-born persons, and also racially passed as white and legislative as such in the year of 1794 due to their complexion. These bills constantly, as I mentioned before, mentioned race throughout. It was deemed to elevate them above other people of mixed heritage. Mention was also made of their black blood,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of the extent of this black blood. And it said that their black blood made them liable to the same pains, penalties, punishments as free mulattoes and black. Um, and it also stated that what ultimately separated them from the less fortunate colored class was the ability to ascend their racial class due to the education, religious practice, and the wealth and property that was being passed to them. And of course, the erasure of their black blood, at least in law. Yeah. So I
No,
found
definitely.
that was one of the first cases I saw where they noted their complexion. They noted that the complexion was the first
Yeah.
sign of their ability to pass, and then of course they had to have children that were
Exactly.
a union with another white person. And
Exactly.
yeah, and then one other example that I would give is of John Clifford, who was a merchant, and he provided in his bill that his offspring and his grandchildren had to be within two removes of white people in order to obtain those rights and privileges of naturally born English persons. So if did not occur, or at least I don't know how we graded it, if it had to be visible, or because of course they had to have children with white persons, but we know that not just because a mixed person has relations with a white person, that does not guarantee that the children would not look as
Exactly.
if they're mixed or if they have black blood. So I'm guessing he went also by complexion in order to grant these rights and privileges. And I found that very interesting,
No,
that this was that this is what he put in law,
yeah.
in order for them to uh, obtain the property. Yeah.
No, definitely, because when you mention about the description, because especially with the Anne Davis, she's defined as being mulatto, a free
Yes.
mulatto, and her
Yes.
children are then defined as being quadroon,
Yes.
which is already they're already considered to be, but he went one step further and made it a legal act because of
Yes.
the inheritance that he wanted to provide his children, which
Yes.
was
Yes.
quite significant.
It was. It
Yeah,
was. It was.
no,
And more followed.
yes.
More
It
followed. Yeah.
definitely. It just, I guess to, when you take a step back, just to know that these are some of the narratives that are not really told in,
Yes.
in the context of slavery, and not only in the context of slavery, but in the context of the Caribbean, because of their affluence, as you mentioned, they were able to travel, they were able to afford their children a completely different life in terms of
Yes.
with education,
Yes.
because I was able to find that they, had sent them to school in England. And
Yes.
who would have thought,
Oxford, Cambridge. Yes.
who
They
would have
went.
thought at that time that they would have sent their young children on a ship,
Hmm.
you know, to go to from Jamaica to New York, and then from New
Yes.
York on another ship to London to go to private school, which would be considered to be at that time elementary.
Yes.
And you're just, when you see it in a document, you're just blown
Yes.
away because you don't
Yes.
know what to say. Because in the context of slavery, or in that time frame period, you're expecting people not to travel, not to move, not to own
Yes.
property, not
Yes.
to do
Hmm.
not to have power, I guess, or agency of their own
Yes.
life and direction, or to see them in written in books to say that they had positions of what would be seen as power later on, after many generations.
Exactly.
It just impactful as to what these
Yes.
laws really brought forth.
No, this is so true, because I remember coming across um some research on New Orleans,
Hmm.
and it differed so much from what was occurring in colonial Jamaica. I did not know that mixed persons were given such rights, or acknowledged like that by their fathers, because in New Orleans they were acknowledged, but they were put aside. They were like the side family. So uh if it was a French person or a Spanish person in that society that was a wealthy enslaved or plantation owner, they would have their wife, their white wife, and they would have their mixed or black mistress, and then have their children with them that they would take care of, you
Yes.
know, but they were never elevated to a society at on par with a white person. That's why they had this middle mixed they had
Yeah.
a kind of middle ground for mixed persons within that society then, in comparison to colonial Jamaica, where they passed these bills to have them pass as white people. So I found that very interesting, because I think it's very unique
Hmm.
to Jamaica. Yeah.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and to be deemed as a white person, and then to even in today's time, these type of what are you called pet names, or white man, or those types of
Yes.
connotations, those still exist
Yes. Yes.
today,
Yes.
and which is
Browning.
where it's coming from.
Hmm. All of that. Yeah. Yeah.
So I know we've talked a lot about the race, and of course the law being used to elevate these subset of individuals that were mixed race. What would you, I guess, finally just say in terms of the understanding, I guess, of these intricacies of the rights and the racial passing within Jamaican colonial context, contribute to the discussion about power, privilege, and identity in colonial societies.
Right. So these bills, and more so their content, illustrated a level of focus on blurring racial lines and eradicating or erasing any visible Black affinity or ancestry. The bill showed that race and identity were important for social climbing, and the distancing from one's Blackness was necessary to obtain property, privilege, and power. And these bills sought to gatekeep who could ascend in Jamaican colonial society, and also showed the level of power that the plantocracy leveraged by ascertaining where mixed persons fell within the spectrum of mixity or pigmentocracy. And furthermore, it weaponized these mixed race persons against the remainder of their kin, you know, who were not in the same position as them. The white settlers, especially those with wealth and power, were the puppet masters within colonial society. They had such immense power that they were not satisfied with just controlling the enslaved population. They then had to control this population that they contributed to,
Yes.
you know? And it was just not enough to just have them be free. They had to ensure that in that state of freedom, they remain divided from identifying as, Black, or
Hmm.
simply as mixed persons, because, you know, in unity there's strength.
Yes.
And there was no need for that sort of unity in society that enslaved Black people or African people were meant to just labor for capitalist ideologies, which again showed that a huge motivation for colonial slavery was racial.
Yes.
It was racist because it was this particular set of people, and then within their state of being, they still were subdivided
Yes.
even further. And
Mm.
yeah,
No, no, for sure. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I just
no,
wanted
no worries. Yeah,
to say that this goes back to, I know when you first came on talking about the slave codes of 1660s, because that was a division for between indentured servitude or
yes,
servants between the enslaved Africans at that time. Because
yes,
yes, they were both of a lesser class, but it was indicated, as you had referenced, that they got along, but they couldn't have that, so that they both were thinking on the same line, even though they're
yes,
kind of on the same level.
yes,
They wanted to make a division based on race between those
yes,
two. And now with
exactly,
these private acts, again, another further division within that culture, to say, oh, I have a little bit of white in me, I'm now different. And that, unfortunately, same mentality is still um,
existing today. Hmm.
existing today. So
Yes,
I do appreciate that you came on, and to be able to speak to this, because when somebody is researching their family tree, they will come across this, because they can only go so far with the records of birth, death, and marriage. They'll have to now start delving into the laws that were passed for each Caribbean island. And again, it's going to be based on, this is British Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean, Dutch Caribbean, these different
yeah,
types of societies that they'll start to have to now navigate to really find and dig deep to further past, let's say, the fourth or fifth generation of where they are at. But again, I truly appreciate your time coming on and speaking to this, because it is a very important one, and I didn't realize until I was doing it that this is what you'll have to entail. And some of this is not necessarily very nice to see,
yeah,
language like this in terms of
yes,
mulatto, quadroon,
yes, yes,
musty. These
yes.
aren't nice words to
No,
be throwing around, and to
no,
actually see them on a document in a column to say what was their status, what was their color.
yes. So much, so much,
Yeah.
debasement,
Yes.
debasement. It's incredible, and not in a great way. One thing you just mentioned about the continuous division just kind of struck me. As you mentioned, the Comprehensive Slavery Code and the Sovereign's Code.
Yes.
Again, that was made as you mentioned to separate the indentured Irish or convict population from the enslaved from joining together. And then you see another subdivision here within free people of color, as they were referred to then. And even in my, as I mentioned when I opened, I am currently working on indigenous slavery within the Caribbean, and even within that, you saw division as well, because the way the law spoke of native people were very similar to the way they described the enslaved,
Yes.
and so they had to find a way for them not to come together because they came together quite naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And so they made a law which said that they had to all the enslavers had to get rid of them off the islands, because they did not want a combination of both themselves and the enslaved. So at the core of all these laws were continuous division because of fear of insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to maintain status quo and continue this world generation.
Yes.
And to do this is to divide by race, by race or creed or yeah. And so that's a very good point to bring up, Wendy, because it sort of showed me the interweaving of all my different research and how even though they're different topics, they're all very much the
Mm-hmm.
same themes running through it. So thank you for that.
No, thank you for the work that you're doing, because honestly, it I wish I had this type of a reference when I first started, because it can be overwhelming. And I guess in terms of the mindset you have to have when you are, as I said, when you read something in black and white, it is just, mind-boggling. And as I've told you before in many discussions, I've embarrassed myself in many of an archive or in a library when you're reading this, because this is not part of the narrative that
Yes.
is provided for this particular time frame period in this particular region of the Caribbean. I mean, it's barely even talked about, other than, yes, that we had enslaved individuals in that region, and now it's considered as a tourist spot. Like there's nothing else to offer, when there's a lot more there than meets the eye. So again, no, thank you, and I hope that this can help anyone else that is researching their
Yeah.
family tree, or just researching in general, to
Yes.
know what these laws represented and what they meant in terms of the power dynamic for the island. So thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you for having me.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.